All right, we're going to start John chapter 2. So if you've got a Bible, turn to John chapter 2. And the handout that's got the literary design for John's Gospel, it looks like this. We're going to kind of look at a few things there before we dig into the actual text for tonight. So I asked you to read two passages for homework. And I'm not going to ask if you did it because I'm disappointed every time I ask that question. But Isaiah 25 and John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, because those are connected, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. Now, this passage, just like every passage in John's Gospel, is packed. It's got all kinds of cool stuff in it that I've been digging around and finding out about. So there's some literary devices going on here, and then there's also Old Testament connection to Isaiah 25. And I found some cool stuff this week that I didn't know about. And that seems to be the case every time I read John's Gospel. I keep finding more stuff that I didn't know was there on the last reading. If you'll look at what I've put up here, I've added these little yellow boxes, and that'll make sense as we keep going. We'll get to the Bethany part in a little bit, but I wanted to show you that in this first section, which is the section right here, the wedding part, chapters 2 through 4 is designed. John wants you to read that as one unit of information, and the reason we know that is because he starts with Cana as the location, and then this section at the end of chapter 4 will tell you about Cana. He goes back to Cana, and that's John's way of saying this section is now ended, and we're going to go to a new section of things. So he's going to do these four stories that focus on four really important Jewish institutions. So wedding or marriage, the temple, a famous rabbi, and then Jacob's well, which was a sacred well of the Jewish people, although it was in Samaria by this time. So he's going to end that with Cana. The next section, he does the same thing. He mentions this portico, this five colonnade portico, this big place that was on the temple area. He mentions it at the beginning of this section, then he's going to mention it again at the end, and that lets you know, like, I intend for you to read this as one unit. This is how Jewish authors write. Okay, it's weird to us. We don't notice it because we don't know we're supposed to notice it, but ancient Jewish readers would have noticed this stuff, and they would have thought of John's gospel like this. They could see what he was doing. He does the same thing with Bethany. Bethany divides the book into two halves. So he mentions Bethany at the beginning, and there's that 7-day period that leads up to, or starts at Bethany, and then you're supposed to count 7 days. And that leads up to the first sign that he performs, which is what we're going to cover tonight, Jesus' first sign in the Gospel of John. And then that countdown happens again when he mentions Bethany the next time in chapter 11. So he'll mention it again, and he'll tell you 6 days before Passover, and you're supposed to start, I'm supposed to do the week thing again. He does that all the way till Jesus is resurrected. So I've printed that out for you. We'll get to that printout in a minute. But the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out a couple things. One, why does he choose to put this first sign in this spot specifically? And then why did he put the temple thing, the cleansing of the temple? Y'all know that story, right? Where Jesus makes a whip and which many took time making a whip while he was watching what was going on, and he drives people out of the temple. All the other gospel writers put that at the end of the story. It's like in the last week of Jesus' life. John has put it at the beginning. So that's not a contradiction because John is not doing this in order. That's not his point. But a lot of people have wondered, why does he put that story at the beginning? And I'm not real smart, okay, but I think I figured it out. And I'm kind of worried that I might be wrong because I've not found anybody else that says this. So I'm just saying that up front. I could be totally wrong about this. But if you go to Isaiah 25, you start to see that maybe he's put it here because it all fits together in Isaiah 25. So here's what we got to do. Before we even read what John's going to tell us, let's go read Isaiah 25 and see if that makes a difference in how we read John chapter 2. Okay? So y'all want to have some fun? It's fun for me. I love this stuff. So here we go. So Isaiah chapter 25, we're going to start in verse 6, although the whole chapter is really good. But so here's what Isaiah says. He says, on this mountain. Now, before we go any further, that means like Jerusalem, the land of Israel. Specifically, the mountain of God is Jerusalem, where the temple sits. But this is talking about what the Old Testament calls the day of the Lord. And a lot of people think the day of the Lord is like at the end of the world. And there will be a day of the Lord then, but there's multiple days of the Lord throughout the Scripture, okay? When the Babylonians are allowed, or God brings the Babylonians in to take the Israelites captive and take them back to Babylon, that's referred to as the day of the Lord. It's basically when God shows up, it's the day of the Lord, right? Okay, so that's what this is describing. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts, that means the Lord of the heavenly host, will make for all people, so not just Israel, but all people, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine. Can you think of a story about someone providing well-aged wine at a feast? Okay, just hang on to that. And it'll be rich food full of marrow. Now, you don't think about eating bone marrow very often, but the picture here is the choicest meat with the bone still in it, right? You tracking now? Right? Think of a big bone-in ribeye or something like that, right? And just in case you missed it the first time, of aged wine well refined. So clearly here the point is the wine's a big deal, okay? And he, meaning the Lord, Yahweh, will swallow up on this mountain. So think, okay, so he's providing a feast for all people, and they're swallowing up really good, choice, rich food and really, really good wine. They're swallowing up, and at the same time, God is swallowing up. So it's a feast for God too. So what's he going to be swallowing? He's going to swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all people. That's not just Israel, all people. The veil that is spread over all nations. Okay, so we got a feast. We got really good wine, well aged, which means it's the good stuff, right? The real good stuff. And people are going to be, swallowing that up. And then God's going to be eaten too, but he's going to swallow up is to destroy or remove, is the picture here. He's going to remove this covering that is cast over all people. So the imagery here is something is blocking the people to be able to see God for who he really is. Make sense? Okay? And there's a veil mentioned. So he's going to be removing a veil off of the eyes of the people so they can see who he really is, right? So you got a feast, you got wine and food and all that, and then there's a veil going to be removed. It kind of sounds like a wedding, At a wedding you would remove the veil off of some, that's what the groom does, right? He removes the veil off of his bride. Are you smelling what I'm stepping in here? Okay. Right? All right. So this is interesting. Okay. This is what Isaiah said. This is like 700 years before John chapter 2 happens. Okay. So, all right. So just kind of store that away. And God's going to be eating more stuff than just coverings and veils. He will swallow up death forever. He's going to destroy death forever. And Yahweh God will wipe away tears from all faces. Now, you've heard that phrase before, hadn't you? Every tear will be wiped away. But where you remember it from probably is in Revelation. Yeah. So but don't limit it to Revelation. So he will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach. Now, I did some word study here. Reproach is the Hebrew word for like disgrace or shame. So these people have done something, or something's been done to them, or both, that has given them shame and disgrace. And God's going to swallow all that up. Now, what that implies is he's going to take death in himself. He's going to swallow it up. He's going to take shame and disgrace into himself and swallow it up and destroy it. You get the image here that he's taking it on himself away from us and destroying it. Make sense? Okay. So he's going to take away the reproach. For the Lord has spoken. Now, if you go read this in the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek version of the Old Testament. By the way, the Septuagint is what the apostles quote about 80% of the time in the New Testament. They're not quoting the Hebrew text. They're quoting the Greek version. Now, so I went and read that, and I found all kinds of cool stuff that I put in your notes that I can't get to tonight. But in the Septuagint version, it says, the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So the reason that he gives you at the end of this idea is all of this is going to happen because it's the word of the Lord. Okay, let me make the connection for you. Let's jump over to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus is called the Word of the Lord. This prophecy right here is going to happen because of the word of the Lord. 700 years before the word shows up to do it. Isn't that cool? Right? Okay. Now you could stop there, but why stop there? It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. Now think about what we learned last week. People are meeting this guy named Jesus, and they're making statements. Like there's 7 different titles they give Jesus in chapter 1. Remember that? There's 7 titles. And all of them make him sound like he's God. Right? Okay, behold, this is our God. That's what people are going to say when they see this go down. This is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is Yahweh. We have waited for him. Okay, let me back up. Let me translate that for you from Hebrew, okay? They will say on that day, this is I am. Now, in the New Testament, there's a book that might be called John, where Jesus is going to say I am 7 times. Interesting. So on that day, Isaiah says, God says through Isaiah, when all this is going down, people are going to look and say, there's I am. There's Yahweh, right? We've waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. For the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. Rest. A couple weeks ago we talked about, or a couple weeks ago, it was last week. This past Sunday we talked about Noah on Sunday, right? Rest. Noach, right? The hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. The Septuagint version of this text says, and the Lord will bring rest on this mountain. The hand of the Lord is usually talking about strength or him bringing something to us. So he will bring rest on this mountain. And Moab, and you're probably thinking, who's that? Right? Moab by Isaiah's time is an entire nation of people. They come from a guy named Moab, who is one of Lot's daughters. And you can go read that lovely story in Genesis 19, where Lot's daughters get him drunk and have sex with him so they can have children. So if you don't think the Bible's interesting, you should read it. There's a lot more on there than you can find in Gray's Anatomy, I assure you. So Moab is this. You find out later in the story that they've become enemies. They're always fighting against Israel, and they were seen in the Israelite mind as being driven by the powers of evil. The powers of evil, right? So the powers of evil shall be trampled, stepped on, stomped. You get the picture? the serpent's going to get stomped, right? He'll be stomped down in his place as straw is trampled down in a dunghill. I just love that. He's going to stomp the snake like you would stomp straw into a hill of crap. It's like, yes, right? This is like warrior language. I love it. Right? Okay, it gets better. Now what? Look at me. And Yahweh will spread out his hands in the midst of it, in the midst of his city, on this mountain, Jerusalem. He will spread out his hands. You see it? Yeah. As a swimmer spreads out his hands to swim. But Yahweh will lay low his pompous pride together with the skill of his hands. The Septuagint is a little bit clearer on this, but it basically says he's going to come down low. The Apostle Paul would pick up on this and say it this way. I think it's in Philippians chapter 2. It's in your notes somewhere. That Christ emptied himself and came down low in the form of a servant. He will lay low his pompous pride together with the skill of his hands, and the high fortifications of his walls he will bring down, lay low, and cast to the ground to the dust. God's going to bring down his walls. Now you're thinking, why does that matter? Well, if John in chapter 2 has got Isaiah 25 on the brain, maybe that's why he put the temple story about the temple being destroyed in that spot. Because Isaiah 25 ends with God bringing down his walls. I'm just saying it's an option. Everybody online, I could totally be wrong on this, but it makes perfect sense to me, and I think I'm right. But prove me wrong. I don't care. I like being wrong. It just means I'm learning something. So that's what I think's going on here. Now, so the question is, okay, why does that matter? So let's review, and then we're going to jump into John chapter 2, and you're going to just see stuff jump off the page, I hope. All right, so here's what we got in Isaiah 25. God provides food and well-aged wine. That well-aged part is very important. God removes the veil from the nations, not just the Israelites, but from the nations. God defeats death forever. And when all this is going down, people are going to recognize Yahweh as their God. Or they're going to recognize the one doing all of this is Yahweh, their God. God's going to give rest. And in the Jewish mind, that's blessing. And blessing is not fancy cars and spinner rims. They don't even have spinner rims anymore. That's a dated reference. Anyway, I mean, they probably do, but who buys them? So they're not thinking material. They're thinking, if I'm rested, I'm at peace, and that is a blessed life. Right? Okay? God's going to bring us that somehow. You know, somebody later in the story is going to say something like, come to me if you're worn out. I'll give you rest. Blessed are the peacemakers. You know, that kind of stuff. And then God defeats the enemy by spreading out his hands and bringing himself low. That's how he's going to defeat. And Isaiah was called Moab, which is an evil nation driven by the evil powers of evil, right? So he's going to spread out his hands and be humiliated, humbled. That's how he's going to trample the enemy. And God's going to tear down the walls. So that's Isaiah 25. Now that you've got that stuck in your head and you have it all memorized, let's jump over to John chapter 2. And in your notes, I put some stuff from the Septuagint in there that I really want to walk through, but maybe we can do it afterwards. We'll see. Okay, ready? John chapter 2. Now on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. Okay, now I'm going to start in verse 2 and work my way back. Okay, if you were paying attention in chapter 1, you would know that there's now 5 disciples. I think I have this right. Okay, there's 5 disciples that are following Jesus. So how many people are invited to the wedding? 5 disciples, Jesus, and his mother. Huh? You see it? Am I right? Or I'm not good at math, so I could be wrong. Okay. So you got Mary, you got Jesus, and the 5 disciples he's gained so far. There's going to be more people at the wedding than that. I'm just saying that's John's mention. I don't know if he means us to get that, but I noticed it this week. Now, last week I told you that we were counting 7 days. There was a 1 week period. John does this in chapter 1, and he's going to do it again at the end. So there's 2 weeks, and if you take the information in each day of those weeks and stick them side by side, which I did for you in that handout I gave you, and I know you can't read that from here, but you've got it in your hands. But for the people watching online, I'll just show you what's going on here. Because isn't it strange that if this is like the 7th day, why does John call it the 3rd day? That's weird, isn't it? Because if you're counting through the days in chapter 1, chapter 2 starts, it should be the 7th day, and he calls it the 3rd day. That's a hint that something's going on here, because he should have called it the 7th day and he didn't. He called it the 3rd. What's going on? You only make sense out of this when you compare both weeks together, because on the last 7th day, it's the 3rd day, the resurrection. And that's his 7th sign. Up here, on day 1, on the first day 7, which John calls the 3rd day, he does his first sign. The last day 7, it's the 3rd day. He's resurrected on the 3rd day. And it's the 7th sign, the final one. So he means for us to put these together and track them. So I did that for you. I put it side by side. You can have fun with that and see how they relate. Sometimes the days are not connected. They're not compared. They're contrasted. Like in day 3 and 4, people are finding Jesus. But at the end of the gospel on day 3 and 4, Jesus is hiding from people, which is funny to me. Jesus is hiding, right? So that line this might be a terrible joke, we'll see. That line in Forrest Gump where he asks, Lieutenant Dan asks Forrest, have you found Jesus, Gump? And he said, I didn't know we were supposed to be looking for him. Right? Apparently those people, that same idea. There were some Forrest Gumps back then. He was hiding. Anyway, like I said, probably a bad joke. But if you look at this page and you just go right across, you can see John definitely did this on purpose. Okay? Through the Holy Spirit. I'm not insinuating that John's made all this up, right? I mean, the Spirit of God had to get him to do this, because how do you make something this loaded with information? Okay? So we're going to a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and that's important. Cana is going to come up again in chapter 4 to let you know that section's over. And we've got 7 people traveling, going there. Okay? Now, when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand that would have been the most shameful thing that could happen. Okay? Now, the other thing you need to understand is that it's very likely for you to run out of wine, because in our modern weddings, you have like a short ceremony. You hope it's short. And then you have like a few hours at least of a reception. That's the party, right? Okay? In the ancient Jewish world, you would have 7 days of partying. At least 7 days. If you're really wealthy, you might stretch it out to 14. But 7 days was the custom. You would party, and that was the reception party. Okay? So if you're in Galilee and you're not real wealthy, it's very likely, you could run out. So you'd have to cut it short. But you wouldn't dare say, we're going to have to cut this short. We ran out of stuff. Because that would have been a disgrace. Okay? So here's what's going on. A family that apparently knows Mary and Jesus and some of these disciples, because they've been invited to this wedding, are in a bad situation. we're out of wine, which means we have to shut this thing down, and this is going to leave us disgraced. Because in that culture, it's an honor and shame culture. Once you're disgraced, you're always disgraced. You don't get that back. You're always going to be remembered as the group of families, because you got the husband and wife, and then you've got your parents, right? So you got two families on each side. All of them are now disgraced people. And they will always be remembered. That's how that culture kind of worked. So that's the issue happening here. And Jesus said to her, to his mother, he said, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Isn't that weird? Now, this has always baffled me because it sounds rude, right? So I did some research, and I found out that in the ancient world at that time, that was not a rude way to respond. Even, I guess maybe to your mom it'd be a little bit, but that was how it would be perfectly common for a man to refer to someone as just woman, right? So it's not really as big a deal as we make it out to be. But I also found out something else, because remember we learned in chapter 1 that John wants us to have Genesis in our brain and Exodus on our brain. And now we've just found out Isaiah in your brain, right? But so if we take that Genesis idea and track it through, if you look at how Jesus refers to women, and every time he's going to call them woman, not by name, almost every time, until the resurrection. Then he's going to call Mary Magdalene by name, because he calls her woman at first, and she thinks he's the gardener, because it was in a garden, the tomb, and the crucifixion was in a garden, in the middle of a garden. Okay? Then he's going to call her by name, and she recognizes that it's Jesus. Now, track with me for just a minute. If you go back to the Genesis story in the Garden of Eden, and you read Genesis 2 and 3, Adam does not call his wife Eve at first. He calls her woman. It's not till the end of chapter 3 that he names her Eve. So if you're supposed to have Genesis in your head, and you start reading and you find out Jesus keeps calling people woman, and then at the end he uses a name, you would go, oh, he's a new Adam. He's the new Adam, but he's going to get it right? So that doesn't seem as cool to you. That was such a cool connection to me when I figured it out, right? Because it's so weird. Why does he call people woman? But I think that's what's going on. Now, he says this. What does this have to do with me? He's really saying, what does this have to do with me and you? Like, why are you worried about this, and what does it have to do with me? What can we do about it, kind of thing. And he says this weird thing, my hour has not yet come. And this is the thing you're supposed to track. It's all in your notes, where to go track it down. This hour thing just keeps coming up in John's gospel. And a lot of the time he says, my hour has not yet come. Or the narrator will say, they tried to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't because his hour had not yet come. And the whole time you're like, what do you mean by hour? And in other places, Jesus will say, the hour is coming and it's already here, when the true worshipers will worship God in spirit and truth. That's chapter 4. And he'll say these strange things. It's this hour theme. It's not until chapter 12 where Jesus declares the hour has come. And if you keep reading, you figure out the hour is the moment he's going to die. That's his hour, right? So here he's saying, look, if we, woman, if I do some kind of miracle right now, you realize what you're asking for. That kick starts the hour, right? I mean, that pushes things into motion that, woman, I don't think you're ready for, right? I mean, that's kind of what the idea here is here. And his mother completely listened and did exactly what Jesus said. No. His mother turns to the servants, doesn't even reply to what Jesus just said, and said, do whatever he tells you. So what's going on here? Well, Mary knows if we don't get some wine, These families are going to be hurt. This is a big deal. So Jesus, I know who you are, and I know what you can do. You can fix this, right? So how about we fix this? Well, what does this have to do with me? My hour's not yet come. You know what all that's about. You know where that's headed. It's not time for that yet. And Mary goes, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And she turns to the servants and goes, do what he tells you. Completely just, yeah, I know all that already, but I'm your mama, all right? Right? Do whatever he tells you. Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. And y'all know what all that is, right? He assumes you know what he's talking about, right? 6 stone water jars for Jewish rites of purification. I highlighted water in blue because you're supposed to do that through John's gospel, because then it'll jump out at you, okay? So what he's doing here is he's making sure you understand what kind of water jars these are. These aren't just everyday water jars. These are religious water jars. The reason why he tells you that they're stone is because a Jewish reader would know, oh, these are the water jars for purification. Instead of clay or some kind of ceramic, which can actually catch particles in its pores and can become unclean, a stone water jar stays clean. It is not as porous, so that's what they used for their purification rituals. So here's what these were used for in a home or at a place where you might be having a feast. For a Jew, it was not in the Torah to do this, but it was a tradition of the Pharisees that developed later. You had to wash your hands before you touched any food or anything you're about to consume, because that made you clean, right? And we still do that today, hopefully, but it doesn't have a religious significance. It did for them. So for you not to do that, you're now unclean, and you have a whole ritual you have to do to become clean again. You can't even go to the temple until you're clean again, okay? So John's pointing out, Jesus is about to make wine in the religious water. He's about to mess up the holy water. That's what he's doing. Because as soon as it's not water anymore, that whole thing, the vessel, everything is now unclean. That's interesting, isn't it? Right? So he's building you up for this. If you were a Jewish reader, you'd be like, wow, wow, wow. And each of these 6 stone water jars that were for purification hold 20 to 30 gallons each. So this is 120 to 180. Carry the one. Yeah, 120 to 180 gallons of water. Okay? And Jesus said to the servants, these are the people who are serving the wine and the food at the wedding, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And the reason why he tells you that detail is so you know this wasn't a magic trick. It was all the way full with water, and we saw it all the way full with water. He didn't have like wine in the bottom, and they poured the water in, and then, look, wine. It's not a trick, okay? And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. And because Mary had said, do whatever he says, they did what he said, right? Now the master of the feast, when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine and did not know where it came from, and then now the narrator's whispering to you. Now, the servants, they knew, but nobody else did. Okay? The master of the feast, by the way, he's like the head waiter. He's the manager of the crew. It's his responsibility to make sure the food's right, the wine is right. He would taste the wine before they would serve the next glass, because they would serve several glasses. It's a party. We don't like to think about this, but if you got a Baptist background, this bothers you. But that's how they did it. That's what they did. It was a celebration. Okay? The master of the feast tastes the water now become wine. So water has now become red. Keep that in your head. And he doesn't know where it came from. He knew they ran out, but now all of a sudden we have wine. He doesn't know why, but this is a good day. The master of the feast called to the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first." The good wine. That's the wine that'll get you drunk. The good wine first. And when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. So he's telling you about a custom that they would do in that day. It would save you some money. Also, it keeps your whole wedding party from being drunk the whole time. So you serve them really good stuff, get them feeling pretty good, then you start watering down the wine or go into the newer wine that hasn't fermented very long. And you would serve that. And if they've had some good wine, a couple glasses, they don't really notice. That was the custom, okay? And it kind of keeps people from overdoing it. You keep serving them less lethal wine, and it keeps them from passing out drunk at your wedding, which would be a shameful thing as well. He says, but he's talking to the bridegroom here as if he knows what just happened, but he doesn't. But you have kept the good wine until now. So it implies we're later into the 7-day feast when all this went down. You've waited and brought the really good stuff at the end. This is a shocking thing, right? So what does this tell us about what Jesus just did? Now, I called this teaching Jesus Makes Wine because I didn't want to be controversial, but I almost said something about Jesus the bartender or something like that, and I thought somebody will get mad at me for that, and I don't really care, but I don't have time to deal with mad people. So what Jesus is doing right here, he's not making Welch's. There are some groups of Christians who teach that Jesus would not have made alcoholic wine and that he would have never drank alcoholic wine because, that's a sin. And even though the Bible never says it's a sin, it just says be careful. Jesus made oinos. That's the Greek word. That is the word for really good wine. Really good wine wasn't wine with no alcohol. That was new wine that you wouldn't be drinking unless that's all you had. You would wait for it to be good wine. Make sense? Okay? So that's what's going on here. That's just the truth of it. If it makes us uncomfortable, that's our problem. It wasn't a problem for the original readers of this. Okay? They would see it as Jesus has just saved a family from disgrace and brought something that was traditionally understood throughout Jewish history as a sign of blessing. Good wine. Good wine was a sign of blessing. And they get that from their scriptures. It says this in Proverbs. It says this in many places, that wine is a sign of blessing. Right? That's what he's doing. Do you remember that was something in Isaiah that God was going to bring rest/blessing? That's what's happening here. Then he tells you this. This, the first of his signs, and anytime John says first or the next, you're supposed to be counting. All right? So this is sign number 1. This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Okay, this is a loaded verse. We have to understand what this means. We've talked about this before. A sign is something that points to something else, right? So I've said this over and over again, but just in case somebody online hadn't heard this, when you're driving on the road and there's a sign that says there's a curve up ahead, you would never think the sign is the curve. The sign is pointing to the curve. Okay, so when you see sign in the scripture, that's the same concept. So what we just saw, what we just read about, is really cool. It's a miracle, but that's not all there is to it. It actually points to something else. Now, what does it point to? Several things, actually. Isaiah 25 would be a big one that it points to. It points to Jesus as the fulfillment of Isaiah 25. Because remember, God's going to show up on this mountain, in this area, in the promised land. And he's going to provide well-aged wine, right? And all these things. And he's going to swallow up death forever and all that. If you go throughout John's gospel and just have Isaiah 25 sticking on your wall while you're reading it, His whole gospel comes up in Isaiah 25. Almost all the stories, you can find phrases in Isaiah 25 that point back and forth. So this first sign, what is it supposed to do? It says that he manifested his glory. Now, if you read chapter 1 enough times, you'll start to notice these things. The idea of glory and seeing his glory starts in chapter 1, in the prologue. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. He told us that in chapter 1. You're supposed to be watching for that. Boom, chapter 2, here it is. So what does that mean? The word manifest, it means to reveal. It's revealing his glory. Glory means radiance or brightness. And that's an image for this is a divine being. Okay? So what does this sign point to? Jesus is not just a dude. He is a dude who is God. Right? He is a man, and he's way more than a man. And his disciples believed in him. So what were the signs supposed to get people to do? To believe. Right? Now in John's gospel, you're going to see him do signs, and a bunch of people will believe, and there's going to be people who don't. You just follow that through. That's the light and darkness thing, belief and unbelief. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. And they stayed there for a few days. The end. Now, the reason why I highlighted his brothers, because later in John's gospel, I think it's in chapter 7, you find out, because John tells you, now his brothers did not believe in him. They didn't believe. So the reason why I think he mentions it here is to let you know his brothers saw this. And in chapter 7, they still don't believe that he's the Messiah. His own brothers. Now we know that at least 2 of them became believers because they wrote 2 books of the New Testament, James and Jude. Okay? And Jude's really cool. And you'll love it because it's short. It's only 1 chapter, right? There's not even a chapter number. It's like Jude 6 means verse 6, right? So, but it's really interesting. So now, I'm just going to leave this here for a second. We were told in chapter 1, we need to be thinking about Genesis. We need to be thinking about Exodus. So how does this story connect to Exodus? Well, in Exodus, God works through Moses to free his people by performing signs and wonders. Right? And Pharaoh doesn't believe Moses until the last sign. Till the last sign. And all this is in your notes, by the way. And in John's gospel, in chapter 4, Jesus is going to say, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Sounds like Exodus, doesn't it? Right? Now, what was Moses' first sign in Egypt? Anybody know? Come on. He turns water into something red. Blood. And what happens to the Nile River? He's told, I want you to go out to Pharaoh, who's going to be in the water, and I want you to stand on the bank while Pharaoh is bathing in the Nile, and I want you to put your staff down or wave it over the water, I can't remember exactly, and it's going to turn to blood. And all the fish and everything in the river is going to die, and it's going to stink. All of Egypt's going to stink because there'll be no clean water, and it tells you they dug like next to the river thinking maybe they can dig down and clean water would come up, and it was blood. Like, it's going to be terrible. So Moses does a sign to try to get somebody to believe and also prove that somebody's God, the Nile, the God of the Nile, is not in charge anymore, that Yahweh is. So he turns good water, clean water, into blood, and that kills everything. Jesus shows up, turns clean water like literally water meant for cleansing, and turns it into something red, but it points to life, not death. So in the Exodus story, okay, he turns water into blood, and that means judgment for the enemy, but life for God's people. Right? Because Israelites are protected from these things the whole time. Right? In John's gospel, Jesus does a sign that puts judgment on the enemy because they've seen it and they don't believe. You're under judgment. But those who believe are saved. So Jesus' signs point to life. Because he didn't make red water that killed people. He made red water that was cause for celebration. Make sense? So do you see how this is going? Now, what was Moses' last sign? Death of the firstborn. Yeah. All the firstborn male child would be killed. And how could the Israelites avoid this? God tells them, I want you to take a lamb, a male lamb, unblemished, and I want you to kill it because you're going to eat it. When you think kill it, you think sacrifice. Don't think that. Think you can't eat one alive. So you have to kill it, right? You kill the lamb, you put the blood on the wood around your door, and then you go in and you eat the lamb, right? And if you did that, nobody's going to die in your house. No death for you. Death will be like swallowed up. You get it? Right? Okay. What's Jesus' last sign? Well, it's kind of combined. It's that whole cross and resurrection thing all wrapped up into one. He's going to be the Lamb of God who's going to bleed on the wood. Get it? And right not too long before he gets put on the wood, he says, I am the door. That's what he declares to the audience. I am the door, right? So then he bleeds on the wood. And what does that do? It's the lamb dying and bleeding on the cross saves people who believe the signs he did from death, right? And then he rises from the dead. That's the seventh sign in John's gospel. He rises from the dead to prove that it worked. To prove I am who I am. I am who I say I am. I just proved it. You ever seen a guy die, tell you he was going to die and raise again, and then pull it off? I'm him, right? So all this is connected. So when we get these stories stuck in our head, like Genesis and Exodus and Isaiah and all those, and he's probably going to give us some more along the way, we really start to see how John means us to read this. So the reason why I'm teaching it this way is because I want you to learn how to read your Bible this way, because you'll start to enjoy reading your Bible. It really is fun when you start learning how we were intended to read this. You'll start seeing stuff all over the place. I've heard some of you say this, that once we started learning the watch for things in the text, it's like popping off the page. Like, yeah, it's like treasure hunting. It's fun. So what's John trying to say about Jesus in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12? Well, he's trying to tell us that Jesus is the word of the Lord from Isaiah's prophecy. Remember how it ended with, this is going to happen because the word has spoken, right? So he's the word. He's the fulfillment of what Isaiah was talking about. And Jesus is the new Moses performing the signs of eternal life. He's doing signs to point to I am the resurrection and the life, right? I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Like, you want life, you got to come to me, right? You want to get to the Father? You got to come to me, Nathaniel, because you will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, meaning I'm the way to get up there, right? So that's what John's trying to tell us through this story. All right, Here's your homework for next week, and then we'll do some Q&A. We might jump back into Septuagint for a minute. We'll see. What time is it? 7:35. All right. Here's your homework. We're going to cover the rest of chapter 2 next week. This is the temple scene where he clears out the temple with a whip. It's a cool story. Here's what I want you to do, and I really want you to do this. Okay? Jesus is going to say to all the people that he's just swung a whip at, he's going to say something about his Father's house. My Father's house is to be a house of prayer, right? You've turned my Father's house into a den of thieves, okay? So just flip through John's gospel and try to find everywhere where Jesus says something about my Father's house. Now, you already know about one because you've heard it at every funeral and a lot of hymns, right? In my Father's house, there are many mansions. Yeah, actual word is dwelling places, rooms. In my Father's house, there's plenty of space. Okay, so just track down and see what you find. Okay, and then if you want some extra credit, go read some Old Testament stuff, and then go back and read John 2:13 through 25, and then go back and read the Old Testament verses here, and just keep going back and forth. Just take one a day. Like take Malachi tomorrow and read the temple scene in John 2 and Malachi 3:1 through 3. And then tomorrow pick the next one. Could be your devotion time for the next week. And just see what you find. Okay, that's for extra credit. All right? We'll have some suckers or something we'll give you. If you do, probably not, but you can imagine it. Okay? All right, so that's what we're going to cover next week, the temple scene in John chapter 2.